author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we're going to be discussing what's happening with Israel, Palestine, and college campuses across the United States of America, what's happening overseas in Israel, and we also have some talk about the Supreme Court and their new code of conduct. It's going to be quite the show. Let's get started. College kids and even professors seem to be engaged in pro-Palestinian activism to a degree that frankly shocks the mind and spirit. Now, how do a bunch of American kids get so fired up about a war in which American troops are not even engaged? Well, we're very fortunate to have with us today Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Ms. Lisa K. Donner, who wrote about just this topic. So fingers crossed, we should have an answer. Thanks for being here, Lisa.
Good to be here with you, Mark. Yeah, this has been kind of a perplexing issue that cropped up out of nowhere, or it seemed to, and I've done a lot of research.
That's the
and
thing.
written
Let
a
me
couple
just
of articles.
Let me just point out that your coverage of this has been superb. You
Thank
followed the trails everywhere on this about why such activism is taking place, how it all gets there, and you can read about it under the Lisa K. Donner byline on the pages of LibertyNation.com. If you haven't seen it, get there and go there.
Well, indeed, Mark Levin tweeted out one of my stories, and I think research really helps people understand, but let's start with the latest that's happened, and that was on November 14th. 300,000 pro-Israel people showed up in the U.S. Capitol. This, this compares to last week. The U.S. Park Service stopped giving numbers because it got to be too political. But I have heard that 300,000 pro-Israel people showed up this weekend. As for last weekend and the pro-Palestinian, I have no number for that. But anyway, it was massive.
I can throw a number in for you, Lisa, not that specific one, but in the UK on Remembrance Sunday, which is
right.
There was around 300,000 pro-Palestinian.
Right, that's what I'm thinking of, the pro-Palestinian protest in London, not in the district. You're absolutely right. But here in D.C. On the 14th, it was massive.
Yeah.
It was peaceful, and it made the point that there is I call it a quiet majority. Richard Nixon coined the phrase silent majority. This is not a silent majority, but they've been a kind of a quiet majority to support the Jewish people and their right to a Jewish state. So that was kind of an interesting and very moving day for anybody who supports Israel. And that begs the question, who supports Israel? But I'll ask you first.
Well, let's get to the big question. Let's get this one out of the way. What's behind the sheer gung-ho activism on the college campuses? Because, I know the answer because I read your article that went out last week in this. But if you'd like to enlighten our listeners, that would be great.
Well, there's two things really fueling all this uprising on the college campuses for the Palestinians and Hamas, etc. One is ignorance. If you want to put it nicely, we'll say a lack of education.
Yeah.
And the other is money, always follow the money. And that tells quite a tale as well.
Yeah, you wrote that from 2014 to 2019, there was, I think, $13 billion was given to over 200 different U.S. colleges and universities. The largest donor being Qatar, which happens to just be the home or the home base of a bunch of Hamas leadership.
Right.
And they gave almost $3 billion. So,
right. So now that you've taken all my talking points,
I'm sorry.
That's okay. It is, you pointed out correctly, it's mind-bending amounts of cash. And what happened was in 2020, remember former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos?
Yeah.
She commissioned a study, and she kind of wanted to see, who's spending what on college campuses. And they came up with, at the time, they found $6.5 billion with a B of what they called undisclosed foreign money. Now, these grants are allowed to be made to colleges and universities, but there's anything over 250,000, they're supposed to disclose.
Yeah,
they're supposed to report them, and they didn't. And so at the time, the big dust up was really about China and how much money China was putting in. But under the radar, like you said, flew all these Arab states, including Qatar, which is the home of a lot of Hamas leaders, as we well know now. And
do you know another big home of Hamas leaders, by the way?
hit me with it, babe.
London, living in
Oh,
what we call
really?
council houses, many of them collecting welfare, but are still engaged, because why not?
Wow.
Collecting British welfare, yeah, which
Right.
many people believe is a hotbed of political corruption. I'm not one to say, but there you go. A lot of
No,
people believe. I couldn't possibly
no
comment.
comment. No comment. Well, when I was researching, it was interesting. There's another study that popped up by the Network Contagion Research Institute, or NCRI. And what they said was, and again, this is going back to 2014 to 2019, but they said that there is such a boatload of, foreign money that was pouring in. And they noted that institutions that accepted money from the Middle East donors had, on average, 300% more anti-Semitic incidents than those institutions that did not. So they were able to correlate the money that came in from Arab countries and the amount of anti-Semitic incidents. And by the way, if you want to talk, what do they call them now? Hate crimes. Jews suffer 4.5 more hate crimes than Muslim or Arab, even if you put Muslim and Arab together. And that's not according to me. That's according to the FBI statistical.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's
information.
obviously the reason why Joe Biden sought to address that issue specifically, directly, the anti-Semitism that takes place. He sought to address it directly by appointing Kamala Harris, again, another czar of Islamophobia. Oh, hang on, that doesn't make any sense. But apparently that's what the Joe Biden does now. Now, Lisa, I think the questions that we've really got to ask here, the most important question that we've got to ask is, what do the institutions think the money is for? They certainly can't see it as, well, here's some largesse. They must love us.
Well, I mean, let's face it.
What do they think?
As a nonprofit educational organization, do they really care? I mean, if somebody wants to give you, a couple $100 million, do you really want to ask them so many questions? I mean, I don't think you do.
Lisa, without derailing my integrity, if somebody did want to give me a couple of $100 million, please do contact me through libertynation.com. I'm your man. I am your man.
Won't ask it. You won't be asking too many questions.
No questions asked, which really kind of proves your point, right?
Well, it's interesting because I carefully quoted Christopher Marlowe, but I got some blowback from that. But I said there, it was a little bit questionable whether he said it or not. Do you remember the quote?
I do remember it. I do. Money doesn't buy love, but it sure improves your bargaining position. Is it something like that?
Yes, that's exactly it. Well, whether he said it or not, and he probably didn't, but it certainly was apropos of the moment. I think what's happened is things have turned on college campuses, but with the hierarchy, the presidents, the boards, and these are 200 colleges, is a lot of colleges and universities, including the big ones. Of course, they gave to all the Ivy Leagues. It, may have bought them some love, but it definitely bought them silence. I mean, there hasn't been too much of a blowback from a lot of these educational institutions. Suddenly they're all, oh, free speech, when that wasn't necessarily the case.
It's funny how quickly
Ann Coulter wanted to get on Ann Coulter's free speech had to be, zipped.
Oh yeah. Well,
and uninvited.
Everybody's getting uninvited from college campuses until, of course, it suits them to be bastions of free speech. Lisa K. Donnett, we'll be back with you after this short break. Listeners, don't go anywhere. It's going to be quite the show.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donnett. Earlier in the show, we were talking about the vast sums. I can't even describe how much money it is that goes flowing into American universities from Arab Muslim states. I
wrote mind-bending, so you're welcome to.
I'll use that word. It is mind-bending.
It is. It really is.
Now, tell me about the students, Lisa. Tell me about the students. Why are they
It's
so
interesting.
open to to essentially they're being paid to be activists and they don't even realize it?
Well, first of all, we've got something going on called a lack of education. In this case, ignorance is not bliss. It just really isn't. Mark, a recent report found out that nearly one-third of all Americans, that's 31%, and more than 4 in 10 millennials, 41%, believe that substantially less than 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. So we're talking 1 million, 2 million. Some of them say, I don't know. I mean, basically, they just aren't educated about the Holocaust and World War II. And this isn't something that happened centuries and centuries
Hmm.
ago, We're not talking about the Roman occupation of Israel or something like that. We're talking about something that was a prime, I guess, the most significant event of the 20th century. I think
Oh
that's
yeah.
fair to say.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned those numbers because we know ourselves that polls, the polls they aren't always understand. And maybe you don't know somebody personally who believes that, but there was Ben Shapiro was at in England recently and speaking at the Oxford and Cambridge unions.
He wasn't disinvited. Oh,
No, 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 he was there because they were talking about this particular event.
uh-huh.
Excuse me. And one of the young Muslim ladies who was questioning him uh, said it's different to the Second World War because Britain didn't bomb German civilians, and it was she'd never heard of Dresden, or she didn't understand that Dresden it demolished the entire
I was
city
going
of
to
Dresden.
say, yeah, yeah.
She didn't seem to know that had even happened, and I mean that literally there was a gasp within the hall, so at least some of the students did understand that knew that they just went oh when she said that Britain didn't bomb German cities. But
Yeah,
these are the elite universities, and they don't know basic history, Lisa.
well, what I could find, and I did a lot of research on this, but what I could find was that 23 states have laws mandating the Holocaust be taught in schools in the United States. Of course, that leaves 27 that don't have the mandate. But it sort of bothers me. Why do we have to have a mandate? I
Hmm.
mean, this is American history. We're talking 6 million Jews. We're also talking hundreds of thousands of Americans who fought in this war.
Yeah,
Men, women, young people, who gave their lives
yeah.
so that, we
Hundreds of
wouldn't be
thousands
speaking
in each
German
theater.
today.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of American lives in each theater of war, Europe and the Pacific.
Yeah, so why do we have to mandate that the Holocaust be taught? Why isn't that just part of American history? I don't know, but
That, that's a
I think
that's a valid question. I don't think that anybody who runs these educational institutions or even the education boards are likely to give you an answer. I mean, that they will go to the wall to include a gay character in a kiddies book. But in terms of teaching actual history, it seems as though they only want to teach a specific history that creates a narrative. I mean, we heard
right.
about
So
the
so then does it come as
1619
any
bombing.
surprise that the demographics for these people that are pro-Israel are older Americans versus younger Americans,
Yeah,
Republicans over liberal Democrats, right?
yeah,
A recent poll, I was reading AP, and they found 50% of Democrats approve of how Biden has navigated the conflict, while 46% of the Democrats disapprove of how he's handled it. And that's really interesting because the party of the Jewish people in America has always been the Democratic Party, always. And
yeah.
now that seems to be rapidly changing, over considering there's the voice of the squad and
Sure.
4 or 5 people, but they're shouting louder and louder.
Well, there's something to be said for the idea of having a big tent. But if you have a big tent, you also can't be too controlling or too vociferous in your positions because that big tent is going to get alienated and turn into lots of little tents. And I think this is what's happened to the Democrats. Uh, they've tried to pull everybody together, a group of disparate people who are essentially anti-Republican. That's what they tried to get together.
Exactly. Now I think the Jewish Democrats are really rethinking their party positions, and they really should. Now, so far, Biden and company has hung on to a pro-Israel sentiment, but I wonder if that's starting to slip just a little bit in their verbal comments. Have you noticed?
I have indeed. There was a couple of interesting things that happened a week or so ago. It was the the Muslim Democrat Association. I can't remember the exact name of it, but they sent Joe Biden a letter saying you need to call for a ceasefire, or all of our
Right,
funding, all of our things, we're pulling
right.
it. And anyway, the very next day, Anthony Blinken wings his way out
Yes,
to Israel to
yes.
say we just need a pause for
Pause. It's not a
humanitarian aid.
ceasefire. It's a
And
pause.
the cracks are forming in this, what I
Yeah.
thought, and I was actually very surprised when Joe Biden made his first speech on this. And I thought he was coherent, which blew me away from the start. He was actually coherent, but he talked, and he talked with a lot of strength. And I thought, well, this is probably what's needed. You know, you need Joe Biden to be, as the leader of the free world, to be strong and coherent. And he looked it, and it seemed, you know, I was almost convinced for a moment, and then this happens, and he sends Anthony Blinken off to go
Right.
and
It's not a
argue for
ceasefire.
that.
It's a pause. Right.
Yeah. And then of course, you know, he's got his red lines, which anybody who remembers Barack Obama's red lines will know where this is going to end. Where he said, if anybody else is thinking about getting involved, don't. And then he looked at the camera, don't. He said it again, very serious. And I thought, oh, that could work. Anyway, the next day,
Yeah.
you have the who is it in Lebanon? The Hezbollah
The
in Lebanon
Hezbollah.
start throwing
Right.
in a few rockets here
Right.
and there, and then
Right.
a
Right.
week later, you've got the Houthis out in Yemen, and they've started
Right.
bombing in, and they're going after the shipping lane. So
Right.
everybody got involved, and everybody ignored Joe Biden. And what did he do?
He bombed an empty
He bombed an empty warehouse. Yes, that
warehouse.
was
It
it.
was an empty warehouse.
Yeah,
Right. Right.
that's the extent of the response under Joe Biden. So the cracks are forming in both the leadership and the party. You're absolutely right, Lisa. I can't see how he can hold together a loose coalition when he doesn't even have the courage of his stated convictions.
Well, I just want to wrap it up with one comment about the business of the kids on campuses, and that is, you've got all these groups, the Democratic Socialists of America, the Palestinian Youth Movement, Students for Justice in Palestine, the U.S. Palestinian Community Network. There's all these groups. Then they weren't educated about the Holocaust. Then there's tons of money flowing in from Qatar and other Arab nations. It's almost like they don't have a chance of really figuring out, you know, it's just much easier to go along with the crowd. And the crowd now is, at least on campuses in the United States, is very pro-Palestinian. And it's really very scary, I think, especially if you're on campus and you're a Jewish student. And it's a far way away from U.S. policy and where it has been for almost a century.
Absolutely right, Lisa. And it brings no surprise that homeschooling is on the massive ride.
Massive, yes.
Lisa K. Donna, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
What's the latest in Israel? What is the US position? And what is happening with the IDF and the Hamas battling in the streets of Gaza? Now, we're very fortunate to have with us today our national security correspondent over at libertynation.com, who happens to be a retired Air Force pilot. He's also the former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller. Dave, thanks for being with us.
Happy to be with you, Mark, always.
So, Dave, the news is changing pretty much day by day, but what's the latest situation at time of recording in Gaza?
Well, I think that what's happening, and I think the Institute for the Study of War is an excellent source to find out how things are moving in terms of a timeline. But it appears as though Hamas fighters are attempting to slow the pace of the fighting against Israel Defense Force soldiers. And basically that does two things. It provides them time to rally support among, their terrorist allies like Iran, and to generate opposition to Israel internationally. And what they're doing is they're trading space for time. And the second thing is that it, as you might suspect, it wears down the Israelis according to their thinking. But so far, the IDF continues to advance, albeit slowly, but I think that's more a feature of their attempt to keep the civilian casualties low, and also to be very deliberate about how they deal with Hamas and their network of tunnels and so forth. I think it's interesting that in November 4th, the IDF captured Hamas battle plans, and what it's, the battle plans are pretty much what I just said, this delaying action, and it allowed their leadership and fighters to flee the Al-Shifa hospital, and also provided the Israelis the opportunity to show clear evidence that the Hamas terrorists do in fact use hospitals and patients and civilians as a shield for their fighting.
Well, that actually came to light this week as well, didn't it? With National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, who said that the U.S. has gathered intelligence that demonstrates that Israel's claim that Hamas uses hospitals and tunnels underneath them to conceal and support military operations and hold hostages. And so it's the fact that the U.S. has independently verified this. I think that does a lot against the propaganda war that Hamas is fighting, doesn't it?
Yes, it really does. But the problem, of course, is that the U.S. national security team is no better than the Israelis in getting out the message and basically countering the disinformation that comes from Hamas and others who want to see Israel defeated. So, to your point, yes, it does, and they need to push that narrative much more strongly. But I think too that there are other things afoot. You also have these Biden administration warnings that they don't want to see the Gaza fighting seep into the region any more than it is. Meanwhile, Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen have threatened to attack Israeli shipping in the Red Sea, and they're firing missiles and drones at Israel. So I think that that train has left the station. The fighting has in fact crept into the region, and additionally, you have the Iranian-backed fighters who are shelling and attacking U.S. outposts and bases, and
I know your thoughts on this. I think you wrote a piece. There's been over 100 attacks on U.S. assets.
That's right. I call it in the category of "you've got to be kidding me." The Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh on the 14th of November explained that the paltry airstrikes as an attempt of deterrence are in fact working, and then goes on to explain about the 56 attacks on U.S. outposts from Syria and Iraq, and the MQ-9 being shot down by the Houthi terrorists. So I don't know what her definition of deterrence working is, but by golly, she stuck with it.
You did a really fascinating piece recently about the U.S. response seems to be find an empty warehouse, bomb it, and say, look what we did. I think that pretty much encapsulates the response there. Let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned at the beginning of the segment here about Hamas and, of course, other terrorist groups operating in the region, because there are many, about how they're trying to slow the spread or the effective capture area of the IDF. And part of that is by embedding themselves with civilian populations. Now, I think in another article you wrote, really, Dave Patterson has been writing piece after piece of the pages of libertynation.com. I believe it's the most comprehensive collection of analysis available out there. If you haven't read it, please go to libertynation.com and check it out.
Thank you, Mark.
You talked about a lot of people are calling these war crimes when civilians get killed, whilst the IDF are hunting down Hamas terrorists. And your explanation of it was just fascinating, because it's something that I kind of took for granted, that I knew what a war crime was constituted of, or what constituted a war crime. And I guess I didn't know. Could you give us a brief description of what the accusation is and what the reality is there?
Well, the accusation is that because the Israelis are fighting a war, and that includes the killing or wounding of civilians, that they are therefore guilty of war crimes. And that's simply not the case at all. And it's not the case based on the Geneva Convention either. And the Geneva Convention proscribes a belligerent from intentionally using civilian people or their property as a shield to basically attack the opposition. That is a war crime. And
it's precisely what Hamas does.
And that's exactly what Hamas does, precisely. But it also says that if you are attacking a military objective that will, in fact, further your efforts as a fighter on the battlefield, and you encounter opposition using civilians as shields, that you are obliged to continue your attack. That, and unfortunately, but if they're shooting at you and they represent a threat, then the war continues.
Yeah, Ben Shapiro, the conservative podcast host, captain of the Daily Wire, he was recently at the Oxford Union at a debate in the UK.
Yes.
And yeah, he made a couple of very good points to people who were questioning him on this topic. And he asked the young lady there, he says, well, so you're saying that if a terrorist can hide themselves in a crowd, essentially they're immune. They get away with it. And he was making the point that clearly that's not the reality of war fighting. These things are just getting more convoluted. What we need is more clarity. Everybody, I think, needs to understand what the reality on the ground is there. And Dave, I think you've done some great reporting on this, and I do recommend everybody goes and reads it under the byline Dave Patterson. Dave, thank you ever so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Supreme Court signs an ethics pledge for the first time. The rules and regulations that govern the Supreme Court's moral responsibilities is now in paper. Now, what does that mean? What are the ramifications of such a thing? Well, we're fortunate to be joined by somebody who does happen to know the law somewhat better than myself, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, which is not just all law, by the way, so I please do recommend you go and listen to it. Scott DeCosenza, thanks for being here.
It's an event-driven podcast, Mark, and thank you so much for the compliment. And I apologize to start with a correction for you, which is that it doesn't address the justices' morals, this new document, but their conduct exclusively. It is that is absolutely correct.
Although presumably the people who were pushing for it would wish that such conduct would be moral in nature.
Well, I'm not going to make that assumpking, but
absolutely right.
Take note that you have.
So Scott, yes. let's dig into this then. So all 9 justices, including Chief Justice, signed this code of conduct. Now, what does the code of conduct say?
So the code of conduct basically gathers and reproduces the current binding judicial code of conduct that governs federal judges that are lower court judges, that are not Supreme Court justices, and then sort of make some adaptations with respect to those rules to accommodate Supreme Court justices because their role is unique and different than any of the other federal judges. So there are no major changes or rules that are kind of like substantially different, except for ones that accommodate for the role that justices play that judges do not play, which is to say you can't replace a justice on a case. If a justice recuses themselves, then the body of the court is reduced by one and will not be replaced. Unlike, for instance, any of the courts of appeals, they can borrow a judge from either pull one up from the district courts or borrow one from lateral.
Buy. Yes, of course.
Yeah, well, at least with an option.
Sure. So there's nothing new in the code of conduct per se, other than it's now been put into a single document and the justices have agreed to abide by that.
That is yes, Mark, and I just want to chime in. It is kind of stunning. It's a big deal that these justices who have never done something like this before, and unanimously so, have published this code that they say they agreed to.
The reason I find this such a fascinating story is because if you have a code of conduct, that would presuppose that there's somebody to enforce the code of conduct or to address a remedy to actions taken that have transgressed the code of conduct. Now, who would that be? Because the Supreme Court is one of the three co-equal branches of government. So presumably that would be Congress would then come down like a ton of bricks, as we say in my part of the world, on the justices should they breach the pledge that they've signed. Is that about right?
Well, that's certainly how Sheldon Whitehouse and Dick Durbin, I think, are going to interpret it.
Two Democrats.
That's one of the reasons why I was surprised to see them to issue this statement, Mark, because it does sort of beg the question: then what? Who's going to handle the complaints against the justices who people allege have fallen short of this standard? And while the attacks against Clarence Thomas are, I think, top of mind, as Karine Jean-Pierre would say, Justice Sotomayor
let's just
certainly.
Be clear on this, by the way, that phrase was first used by Joe Biden, and nobody had ever used that phrase before. And now people are using it just to make out that Joe Biden hasn't lost his mind by saying it.
Oh, really? That's so funny.
Sorry, please carry on.
Yeah, it actually sounds vaguely British to these American ears, by the way.
No, it's just a Bidenism.
You could embrace it and just invent it like it was your own. Well, Sotomayor
and then
has
Joe Biden stole it from the British, like as in plagiarism,
right?
As in like he did before with
Neil Kinnock or Patty Ashdown or whoever, or all of them he's stolen from. Well, I was just going to point out that Justice Sotomayor has her own troubles with respect to ethics and using court staff inappropriately, which we've talked about here. So it's not just people on the sort of anti-Thomas or anti-conservative progressives who might rush to file complaints against justices. It's also folks on the right or who oppose progressive justices. So it's a sticky wicket all around. And like you say, the Supreme Court is supposed to be an independent third branch of government. And what I think this does is it opens up really the Congress to be kind of an overseer of the court rather than, they're supposed to execute checks and balances. All the branches are supposed to be co-equal. And previous to now, the method by which the Congress could assert its check on the Supreme Court is to impeach any justice they wanted to for anything they found relevant enough, to warrant impeachment. That was the method. And now we're going to see, I think, more calls for hearings, for information about justices' compliance with this lengthy document. There's financial compliance, there's familial compliance, what ones, people who reside in the same house, what their businesses are. So for somebody who wants to make mischief, there's an ocean there now of opportunity, I think, that's been opened by this issuance.
Something that springs to mind there, Scott, is you say that Congress can already impeach justices, which I think is quite well known. But surely if they had concerns about ethical behaviors of justices on the Supreme Court, then they would have done so instead of pressuring, which is what happened, right? There was a pressure campaign against the Supreme Court body to draft and adopt a code of conduct. But if they had a genuine complaint, other than looking for leverage in the future that politicians within Congress can use, surely they would have just gone for the impeachment route.
I think that's true. There's another component to it, Mark, that's kind of extra devious, I think, which is that
everything is devious about this, Scott.
which is that part of the role of the jurists, the justices on the court, is to keep high or at least not denigrate the reputation of the court in the public eye, and to uphold standards that the public can recognize as appropriately lofty for its position. And so what the masterful job was of the progressive attacks against the court are they produced the reality where the justices thought they needed, at least Roberts, I presume, and then with agreement from a significant number. You got to assume there's at least one or two who really went kicking and screaming before they signed it. But I presume Roberts and a majority of the others really wanted this out there, and I think that's why. It's because of the pressure wall from the progressive side that was generated by Durbin and by White House and their use of the Senate Judiciary Committee to drive this.
It's you stop short of using the term a weaponized judiciary committee, but to me that I would say that would be a fair accusation if you were to level it.
It's a political body. Those are politicians. They are interested in their own political well-being and their party's political well-being and fundraising, and that's true for all of those representatives. Like, I always want to put out there at the very front of it, Mark, it's about politics, 100%. And that's how we should view it.
Absolutely. Now, let's just wrap up one final question on this. Does the code of conduct that the Supreme Court justices signed, does that reference in any way the horrendous abuse of taxpayer-funded staff that Justice Sonia Sotomayor engaged in?
Well, it does discuss how justices are to use their staff, and certainly it seems like a lot of these stuff, Mark, is reported but yet not confirmed. Meaning, whether it's about Justice Thomas or Justice Sotomayor, we have indications that we may believe this is what they did, and good reason to do it, good reason to believe it based on the reports, but it's not a fact, but we have reason to believe that Justice Sotomayor uses her staff in manner that is explicitly forbidden, not just by the new statement of the court regarding their code of conduct, but also previously existing kind of norms with how any government person would use their taxpayer-funded staff, which is to not ship books that they're going to privately profit from, or to use the government phone lines and their time to strong-arm librarians into buying extra copies of them, all of which Justice Sotomayor has been accused of pressing her staff into. So,
and on that note, Scott DeCosenza, we'll leave it there. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests for today, Lisa K. Donner, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com, national security correspondent Dave Patterson, and legal affairs editor Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Esquire. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in and be with us each and every week. Thanks for being here. We'll see you soon.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at LibertyNation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.